When we left that day, I saw villages burning everywhere, and it made me wonder if that was hell.
This is the worst situation the Rohingya have faced, despite fewer people being affected.
International humanitarian law should protect civilians in conflict. But since the military coup in Myanmar, thousands of civilians have been killed, several millions displaced, and tens of thousands of houses torched. One of the most recent cases was the burning of Buthidaung in northern Rakhine when the AA captured the city. The details of that time are still unclear and highly contested, but Doh Athan has heard from eyewitnesses. Hello and welcome to Doh Athan, a weekly podcast about human rights stories from Myanmar. It's brought to you by Fondation Hirondelle. This episode is produced by a Frontier Myanmar journalist. Names and voices may have been changed to protect contributors. On the night of 17th of May, just after 10 p.m, 32-year-old Ladiya was preparing to go to sleep. She'd already tucked her 3 children into bed at their relative's house in Buthidaung. Then she heard what sounded like a fire breaking out in the house next door, and a voice shouting repeatedly in the Rakhine language, "Get out of the house!" From further away came the sound of heavy weapons and gunshots. She quickly grabbed her toddler. Her husband took charge of their 2 older children, and they fled the house. As they ran, Ladiya glanced back to see the fire spreading from one house to the next.
I was terrified, wondering if the heavy weapons would hit us. I thought I might die there, so I just ran in fear. I couldn't think of anything else. I just kept running, like a fool. I forgot all about my personal belongings. I was carrying my child, like a bag.
The family had already moved from their home in a village outside Buthidaung to try and escape the spreading conflict. But that night, Ladiya and her relatives found themselves among thousands fleeing west towards Maung Maung. But around 2 a.m, the crowd was stopped at the Western Region Military Base 1, which had been captured by the Arakan Army, or AA.
As we got near the gate, we realized that people there could only speak Rakhine. It was even scarier than meeting soldiers. They shouted, asking if we were with the Hunter troops, or People's Militia, or with URSA. And a boy at about 15 or 16 yelled, "I'm with the People's Militia," and then AA dragged him out, beat him up, tied him, and then took him with them. It all happened right in front of us.
Also in that crowd was Maung Maung, a shop owner who'd been staying with his in-laws in Ward 4 that night. The sound of gunshots and reports of fires elsewhere compelled him to get out. He says the sheer volume of people fleeing forced motorbikes and cars to travel slowly, matching the speed of those escaping on foot. At the military base, Maung Maung says the AA soldiers instructed everyone to bow their heads. He says about 15 people were arrested, suspected of being members of the so-called People's Militias of Rohingyas created by the military. Nobody knows what happened to them after. But Maung Maung fled all the way to Yangon before he even told his wife and family, who live in a village outside Buthidaung.
This is worse than the situation in Gaza. I couldn't think about my children, my wife, my village, or my family. Nobody knows what's going to happen next, at what time. What happened in 2017 wasn't even half as bad as what's happening now. The military, they shoot, but they slow down when the international community talks about it. I don't know who these people are or what their goals are.
Maung Maung's shop burned down that night, along with large swathes of the city. Many eyewitnesses say AA soldiers were responsible. It's part of a broader pattern of violence, particularly in recent months. The military has inflamed racial tensions in Rakhine by forcing Rohingya to join its militias and to take part in anti-AA protests. These groups were accused of torching the homes of Rakhine and Hindu residents in Buthidaung in April. Estimates range between the hundreds to the AA's claim of over 2,200. Rohingya human rights activist Gonesan Nguyen has estimated from satellite imagery that over 8,500 Rohingya homes in Buthidaung were burned between the end of March and the end of May. International humanitarian law should protect civilians against all forms of violence. Civilians are supposed to be treated humanely, without discrimination. On 22nd of May, a coalition of 195 civil society groups urged the AA to hold accountable those who had committed violence in northern Rakhine, including the arson on Rohingya homes. Doh Athan asked AA spokesman Kyaw if they had investigated what happened that night in Buthidaung.
We investigate all complaints to see if they're real. We train our members systematically in protecting civilians and saving lives on the battlefield, and in saving the public's lives and livelihoods.
The AA has always vehemently denied they were responsible for any arson or violence that night. Kyaw repeated this claim to Doh Athan.
On the night of May 17th, before we entered, armed terrorist Muslim groups and the terrorist SAC troops set fire to every house they saw in Buthidaung as they retreated. The terrorist SAC also used airstrikes and heavy weapons. That's why there was a fire outbreak in the city that night.
But 24-year-old Goh witnessed the arson firsthand. He was staying in Ward 2. Around 9:30 p.m, he watched around 15 AA soldiers enter the neighbourhood and start setting fire to houses.
If people didn't come out of their houses, they shot guns into the air. Fire surrounded us, reaching as high as 100, 150, even 200 feet. One guy tried to put out the fire but was threatened at gunpoint. They used lighters and gasoline to set the houses on fire, and it spread quickly. They also left grenades. The fire spread so fast. I don't know what they used, but it must have been a lot of gasoline. The whole area was ablaze, almost like it was a sunrise.
The next day, AA soldiers informed residents there'd been a battle with the military the previous night. However, Rohingya who spoke with Doh Athan claimed that junta troops had left the area by 15th of May, and it was the AA who was responsible for the burning. They were mainly identified by their ability to speak Rakhine, unlike the military. A recent Reuters report came to similar conclusions about that night, and an ongoing UN human rights investigation is reportedly finding every indication that AA soldiers were responsible for the arson. His house was not burned down, but Goh was still traumatized by the experience.
Honestly, I've been living with these feelings since 2012. I've got used to it now. We live like slaves with no human rights, treated like animals in the jungle. They made us get used to it because it happens every day. If I die, I die. If I live, I live. There's no other way. That's just how our lives are.
Initial news reports suggest around 45 Rohingya people died that night, but it's hard to verify the figures. Thousands of people are reported to have been displaced. An internet and telecoms blackout makes it difficult or impossible to speak to people there. Many people dare not speak openly about what happened. And there were no photos documenting the attacks. Goh took some pictures, but he says he saw AA members confiscating phones, so he deleted the images. Rohingya activist Gonesan Nguyen said this situation is more severe than the events of 2017, when attacks by Rohingya extremists on border posts prompted a crackdown by the military that is now the subject of an international genocide case.
What happened in 2017 was terrible, but at least people could communicate and access humanitarian aid. The current situation is worse because there's no communication or access to humanitarian aid. There's no freedom. Humanitarian organisations like WFP, INGOs and NGOs have no access to the area. You live by AA's rules. This is the worst situation the Rohingya have faced, despite fewer people being affected.
The day after the burning of Buthidaung, Ladiya and her family decided to move to Saint Kyaw village. This was one of 4 places designated as safe zones by the AA. Their own village was on the way, so she decided to collect some clothes and personal items from their house. After leaving the house, they encountered 2 AA soldiers, who she says extorted 20,000 chats from them. As they walked out of the village, Ladiya looked back and saw her house on fire. She was devastated.
It had only been 2 years we built our house with our hard-earned savings. We saved every penny we could. And then just like that, it was torched. I couldn't even look at it. I don't want to think about it, talk about it, or even see anything related to it. We're left with nothing now.
Walking to Saint Kyaw, they had to pass other villages which were also on fire. Ladiya was horrified.
It has never been this bad before. I've never seen or experienced such battles before, but now I had to. When we left that day, I saw villages burning everywhere, and it made me wonder if that was hell. It felt like hell on earth.
All the people who spoke to Doh Athan somehow made it to Yangon, despite obstacles and the high costs of boat fares, guide fees and bribes at checkpoints. They're safe for now, but anxious about relatives and friends back home. Gojo is worried about his chronically ill mother, still in Buthidaung, who may run out of medication soon. Maung Maung's son suffers from a skin condition, and he's wondering when he can rejoin them back in the village. Ladiya and her husband are staying with relatives in Yangon, but have no jobs. They're struggling to pay rent and school fees for the children. Sometimes she thinks it might have been better to die in Rakhine.
Why are we, the Rohingyas, going through such horrible times? Sometimes I think I wouldn't be suffering if I were dead. I survived, and I got here, and now it feels worse.
Thanks for listening to this edition of Doh Athan. We'd welcome your feedback on social media, and please follow or subscribe to our pages. This project on human rights reporting is supported by Fondation Hirondelle with the help of our donors. You can listen to our podcast via the Doh Athan Facebook page. They can also be found on SoundCloud, YouTube, iTunes, Spotify and Telegram. You can also listen every Saturday night from 9 to 10 p.m. and Sunday morning from 6 to 7 a.m. on Voice of America Radio. Please tune in again next week.